So if you're anything like me, you probably heard everything about the Supreme Court ruling, indictment, Trump, immunity, presidential immunity, and you're wondering what the heck is going on. And you're probably looking for someone on YouTube who doesn't have this strong left or right, Democrat or Republican bias, and is really trying to understand the Supreme Court ruling for what it is. You came to the right place because my name is Christopher. I'm the host of the Open Minds podcast, where I'm trying to explore the world's biggest issues with genuine curiosity. And so in this video, I'm going to try to unpack the decision that was made by the Supreme Court in as clear terms as I can, recognizing first that the Supreme Court does have a conservative majority of judges on it, and certainly that plays a factor in how it looks at issues, how it frames issues, and how it decides on issues. Now, before we get into any of this, a little bit of history is necessary. You see, founding fathers were absolutely obsessed with making sure the executive, judiciary, and the legislative were separated, that they weren't interfering with each other's powers, because this would actually undermine good government. In fact, Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers argued that an energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government. Energy in the executive means that we're protecting the community against foreign attacks, we're steadying the administration of laws, protecting property, and securing liberty against the ambitions of factions and anarchists. And energy in the executive means that we're emboldening the president to make quick and decisive actions. And the reason for that is if we leave the executive to be this conglomerate of executive council members or a group of people, responsibility would be dispersed. Instead, responsibility should be held with one individual, the president, to allow him or her to act decisively and quickly to make sure that all of the powers that are vested in the executive are being enacted quickly. And one of Hamilton's main concerns was the impact of the legislative on the executive. So if a president were worried that legal action would be taken against quick and decisive action, whether in the present or in the future, that president may be less likely to make quick and decisive actions as a result, knowing that the threat of legal action is hanging over their heads. Hamilton even says a feeble executive implies a feeble execution of the government. Decision, activity, secrecy, and dispatch will generally characterize the proceedings of one man in a much more eminent degree than the proceedings of any greater number. Legal challenges could distract the president from his duties, making him overly cautious and hesitant. Okay, so what does this have to do with Donald Trump and the Supreme Court? Well, in the November 2020 election, former President Donald J. Trump was indicted on 4 counts by a federal grand jury. They state that Trump, after losing the election, conspired to overturn the results by spreading false claims of election fraud, thereby obstructing the collection, counting, and certification of election results. This includes using false information and exerting pressure on state officials to alter or invalidate the certified election results. The allegations were based on various statutes, including conspiracy to defraud the United States by spreading false claims of election fraud, obstruction of an official proceeding, and conspiracy against rights, which criminalizes conspiracies to injure, oppress, threaten, or intimidate any person in the free exercise or enjoyment of any right or privilege secured to them by the Constitution. Basically, in a nutshell, Trump was unhappy with the November 2020 election and used his powers to pressure state officials and others to overturn election results. But you see, this is where it gets a bit gray, because you see, the president has the authority to make sure elections are free and fair and there's integrity in the process. And if the president is questioning the integrity of the process, they're well within their rights to do so. The president can use legal channels to question and uphold the integrity of the electoral process. This includes filing lawsuits, requesting recounts, working with federal and state officials. These are all within the presidential duties. You see, it's much harder for a prosecutor to say, hey, Mr. President, we understand it's your right to question the electoral process, but in doing so, you're spreading false claims which are undermining the electoral process and thereby furthering public distrust in the electoral process as a whole. That line of thinking requires much more evidence each step of the way to make sure not only they are accurate, but they're outside the scope of presidential authority. You see, presidential authority allows the president to question electoral results and uphold the integrity of an election. It's much more harder to say by the questioning? Is he undermining the process? In either case, it doesn't matter because the Supreme Court says that's still within the upper limits of presidential authority. Now, let's get to the specifics, because the allegations were that the president went beyond the presidential duties by calling state officials like Georgia to pressure them to find enough votes to overturn the state's election results. In the court's ruling, they found that despite the specific allegations that are brought forward, still is within the upper perimeters of the president's authority. You see, demonstrating coercion of elected officials to find results, the prosecutors really have to show that there's coercive actions that the president undertook to pressure officials to participate in fraudulent activities. But it's much more difficult for the prosecution to prove because there need to be a fact-finding mission. Remember, it's within the president's powers to question the legitimacy of election results. The court noted that certain actions taken by the president, such as engaging with state officials on matters of federal election integrity, could fall within the outer perimeter of the president's official duties. However, the legality of these actions depend on whether they involve improper pressure or coercion that would exceed lawful authority. You see, it's one thing to question electoral results. It's another thing to pressure state officials into acting illegally or participating in illegal activities that would challenge those results as well. So in many ways, when you think of the Supreme Court ruling, it really was to uphold Hamilton's understanding of the effective executive branch. I think the Supreme Court is also putting more pressure on those coming forward with allegations to make sure there is rock solid evidence that what they're putting forward falls outside the scope of presidential authority. You see, this is where it gets very, very dicey. If you're questioning something, does that mean you're undermining something? So in conclusion, the president has every right to question the electoral process and the integrity of elections. The question I think we should be asking ourselves is that questioning undermining public trust in our institutions? As well, allegations against the president become much more challenging to fully articulate. For example, if the president uses legal challenges to question electoral processes, the prosecutor said that the president was using the judiciary branch to undermine the electoral process, but it's within the president's powers to do so, as well to pressure state officials to overturn electoral results and act illegally become much more harder to actually prove in a court of law. Presidents in the future can continue to question electoral results. Now, tinfoil hat on, this may spell further challenges to the American system as we know it. You know, when you look at history, some of the biggest challenges to the Empire of Rome and Aztec Mexico didn't come from without necessarily, but from within. And the questioning of authority and the questioning of electoral results can start showing cracks in the foundation of the American system as we know it. If the president can continue to do this, further undermining of the electoral process as a whole may also lead to people feeling like their votes not only don't count, and that poses a greater threat to democracy and the American system as we know it. But let me know what you think in the comment section below. I know this is a lot to digest. I hope I did it some justice. I'll leave links below to the Supreme Court ruling for you to check out. Thanks again, and I will catch you in the next one.